Good morning to you. Good morning to you. Good morning, good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning, good morning, good morning to you, you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Daring Dialogues. I'm your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful day. Good morning, Lady Barbara. Good morning, Lady Ravonda. This is Thinking Thursday, Theology Thursday. And before we get started, as you know, we are continuing our celebration of Women's History Month all week long. And so I want to give you some more women icons from Urban Intellectuals Black History Flashcards Volume 2. But before we do that, a couple of days ago, I got on my Facebook Live and on my Instagram, and I was telling people about the research that I was doing for the new neighborhood that I live in. Something that I always recommend that people do, especially if you are new to a region or new to a city, new to a state, new to a town, to do some research on the history of that town so that you know what you are dealing with, what you might be dealing with in a town. And so, one of the things that prompted me to do it sooner rather than later was I had a dream the other night. I think it was either Monday or Tuesday night. I had a dream, and it was a dream about a woman from the past. It had to be like 17, 1800s. But anyway, in this dream, I saw the face of the woman very, very, very clearly. And so that is what prompted me to go and research the town that I live in. And come to find out, there's all sorts of interesting things about this particular city. It's very historic, the city that I live in now. And they actually have a history with the Buffalo Soldiers. And if you know anything about the Buffalo Soldiers, that was the all black regiment that fought against the Apache Indians. And that's a whole story around that. But anyway, one of the Buffalo Soldiers was born right here in this town. Another thing that I found interesting was one of my personal goals and visions is actually just a few minutes up the street from me, and that happens to be a boarding school. And this particular boarding school houses students from around the world. So I have to go and check that out too. But the boarding school was actually named after a woman who was known for her anti-slavery work. She was an anti-slavery, anti-racism activist. So that was very exciting to find out. And then the last two things I found out was that at some point in time, Edgar Allan Poe, the poet, actually lived in my town. And the building that I was in doing the research, it turns out that I was sitting in the place where he had come to apply for a job as a teacher, and they rejected him. Now, can you imagine how they feel today that they rejected one of the world's greatest poets as a teacher from teaching in their schools? I was like blown away by that. So yeah, I was actually sitting in that building the other day where Edgar Allan Poe went to apply to become a teacher, and he was turned down by that particular academy at the time. And then let me see. And then the last thing I learned about, which I'll probably be posting shortly, either today or tomorrow, because I'm still gathering the photographs for it, is just a few minutes, a couple of blocks away from me is one of the first free black towns established in Maryland. And the community has been here, of course, since the 1700s. It's one of the oldest free black towns that is still surviving with living descendants from those who first came as former slaves. So there's a lot of history in the town that I live in, and I'm excited about it. Yeah, very rich history. And because we live in the historic part of the town, we will get a chance to see all of the different like parades and things that happen. And they do a Buffalo Soldiers reenactment instead of a Civil War reenactment. Praise God. So we will get to a chance to see all of that during the summer and the fall. It'll be right on Main Street, so all we have to do is walk out and view it, which is pretty exciting. So I wanted to share those pieces with you all. I always encourage people, go make sure that you research your town so you know what has been in your town and you know what to pray about so it doesn't return to your town. All right, let me give you a couple of these and then we are going to move on. This is Ella Baker. Ella Baker was born on my father's birthday, December 12th, 1903. Excuse me, December 13th, 1903. And she passed away on her birthday, December 13th, 1986. Ella Baker was a civil rights activist and behind the scenes organizer, considered by many to be the most influential woman of the civil rights movement because of the work she did with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ella worked beside some of the most prominent civil rights leaders of the 20th century, including Dr. Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, and W.E.B. Du Bois. She served as an organizer on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and guided students who were leading campus sit-ins. She continued her activism in later years and was passionate about solving school desegregation problems, ending apartheid in South Africa, and addressing police brutality issues in the United States. This is Ella Baker. Good morning, Lady Latoya. All right, this young lady is known as Saint Escriva Anastasia. Born in 1800 and the year of her death is unknown. See that thing around her face? That is one of the contraptions that they used to punish slaves. This is actually, I think recently somebody did a fashion show, one of like the well-known fashion brands, and they had this a similar image like this on the front of the person's dress, and people called them out because they were like, wait a minute, yes, exactly. So what exactly were they celebrating? But anyway, her name is Saint Escriva Anastasia. She was an African Brazilian slave and martyred saint of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She was the product of a slave master relationship, and she was born with piercing blue eyes that set her apart from others. She was treated cruelly and forced to wear a slave mask, a collar, and a muzzle made from heavy iron. Forgiving in spirit, Anastasia cured her master's son of a mysterious illness before dying herself from tetanus caused by the slave mask. Now seen as a protector saint of the descendants of slaves and the poor in Brazil. So she has now been elevated to the title of saint because, yeah, it would take a saintly demeanor to save your slave master's son while you yourself are dying. Yeah. Oh, the things that women have been through. This is Fanny Coppin, Fanny Jackson Coppin. She was born October 15th, 1837, and she died January 21st, 1913. Fanny Jackson Coppin was a higher education trailblazer and missionary. She was born a slave but gained her freedom at the age of 12. She eventually studied at Oberlin College in Ohio, the first college in the United States to accept both black and female students. She taught math, she taught Greek, she taught Latin at Philadelphia's Institute for Colored Youth, now known as Cheyney University of Pennsylvania. She became principal of the same school she taught at in 1869, making her the first African American woman to serve in this role. She was also the first African American woman to serve as a school superintendent. She worked with her husband's ministry to promote self help programs in the U.S. and in South Africa. Fannie Jackson Coppin. Awesome women doing awesome things. All right. Since we are on our Thinking Thursday, Theology Thursday, we are going to read a little bit today from Letters to the Church, which ties into pagan Christianity. And then we will spend most of our time in vindicating the vixen. So let's get started. As we know, Francis Chan has been walking us through concepts in what some call the church, but they're really talking about the ecclesia, that maybe don't belong. And so we're on the section called order. And the last thing that we talked about, okay, Lady Latoya, you can come back and watch the replay. The last thing we talked about was Francis Chan sharing with us that he feared that we have created human-centered churches rather than God-centered churches. And he says, I don't say this to condemn anyone or to point any fingers. I was guilty of it too. When I look back at my life in the times when I fell prey to this consumerist mentality, I don't believe that my intentions were evil or that my love for Christ was weak. God may say otherwise in the end, but I really believe my biggest mistake was that I didn't think things through or that I didn't consult the right person enough. I got caught up in consumerism like everyone else, and I paid too much attention to what I wanted and what others wanted. Many of us make decisions based on what brings us the most pleasure. This is how we choose our homes, our jobs, our cars, our clothes, our food, and our churches. We pursue what we want, then we make sure there are no biblical commands that we are violating. In essence, we want to know what God will tolerate rather than what he desires. Maybe we are afraid to ask what will bring him the most pleasure. Ignorance feels better than disobedience. The good news is that by the grace of God, some of us are seeing our failures now, and we are training ourselves to prioritize his desires. Scripture is our starting point, not desire or tradition. Rather than thinking of what we would enjoy or asking others what they would like, we would ask the simple question, what would please God most? Devoted to his orders. The first church was built on the things that pleased God the most. It was their focus on the right things that actually made them attractive. You cannot read through the book of Acts without thinking, that's a community of people that I want to be a part of. What they were doing at the time was unique. It was compelling in a way that nothing else in the world was. This was something the world had never seen. Acts 2:42 through 47 reads, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship and the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Now, When I read that, I hear a structure, I hear an order, but I don't see anybody lording over anyone else. Absent from this account is any attempt on the part of the early Christians to conjure up some sort of powerful experience. They weren't trying to manufacture the power of God. They weren't adding bells and whistles in order to say, this is what the power of God looks like, to draw people in. They weren't strategizing ways to get people interested. After Jesus left them to return to his Father, they were gathering together to ask God to direct them and to work through them. All of these, with one accord, were devoting themselves to prayer. It was in one of these gatherings that the Spirit of God descended on them and the entire church was launched, or the ecclesia really was launched, as they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and prayers. No modern church growth movement would take this approach seriously. How do we know? Because if you tell people that this is the model you're going to follow, they will more than likely criticize you or laugh you to scorn. Because our present day models say that this does not work, even though it worked for the early believers. Where's the excitement? Sure, these elements are the basic building blocks, but do you really think you can accomplish anything with just the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer? After all, haven't there been many who chased this simple approach without experiencing the awe the early church felt? No. There's a key word in the passage that separates the attempts of modern church from the first church, and that word is devoted. In our impatient culture, we want to experience biblical awe without biblical devotion. At the core of our dysfunction is not necessarily our style or our structure, but our lack of devotion. So much of the discussion nowadays revolves around how to make the most of our Sunday morning services. If people are willing to sacrifice 90 minutes a week, we should spend that time singing, preaching, or praying, or a combination of the three. Should we meet in a large group or should we meet in a small one? These are all the wrong questions. We should be asking why Christians are willing to give only 90 minutes a week, if that, to the only thing that really matters in eternity. So leaders work tirelessly to squeeze prayer, teaching, and fellowship and communion into a 90-minute service because they believe that that's all they have to work with. And while we can't force people to be devoted, it may be that we have made it too easy for them not to be devoted. By trying to keep everyone interested and excited, we have created a cheap substitute for devotion to God. Rather than busying themselves with countless endeavors, the early followers devoted themselves to a few, and it changed the world. It seems like the church in America is constantly looking for the next new thing. I can agree. We want to follow the latest trends of church growth, believing there is something we are missing. Once we add one more staff position or one more program or one more conference, then maybe then our churches will become healthy. It's a never-ending game. Haven't we tried that long enough? I don't know. I think some people realize they've tried that long enough and they're trying to get back to the basics. But I would definitely say there are a whole lot of people who are trying to add more and more and more and more and more and more to get people excited about what they should already be excited about, if you understand the gospel and if you understand the grace of God. So we'll come back to that next week. Let's look at pagan Christianity and let's go back real quick and review that Buildings for the believing church, for the ecclesia, buildings did not come into play until 300 years into the faith. All right? Before that, believers, as he talked about in Acts in the other book, they were meeting in houses, they were having house fellowships. And anytime someone passed away, became a martyr, died for the cause, they would go to that person's grave site and they would honor them for having died for the faith. Good morning. That turned into, let's begin to build a space where we can honor those who have died for the faith. That turned into the things that we see today. All right. So they were not just creating sacred spaces over the places that martyrs had been buried. This is why if you go to other countries, uh, it will be called the Church of St. Peter's or whatever, because it is buried on, it is over top of the area where he was buried. So these buildings became sacred spaces that the saints would meet in to honor people who had died for the faith. They were never intended to be spaces where we come and meet every week. I know that's hard for some people to digest, but it's the truth. All right. So they not only had sacred spaces, but they also had sacred objects. And this would later develop into a sacred priesthood. So let's talk Constantine, father of the church building. While the Emperor Constantine, who lived from 285 to 337, is often lauded for granting Christians freedom of worship and expanding their privileges, his story fills a dark page in the history of Christianity. Church buildings began with Constantine, not with Christ, not with Paul, not with Peter. They began with Constantine. The story is astonishing. By the time Constantine emerged on the scene, the atmosphere was ripe for Christians to escape their despised minority status. The temptation to be accepted was too great to resist, and Constantine's influence began in earnest over the ecclesia. In AD 312, Constantine became Caesar of the Western Empire. By 324, he became emperor of the entire Roman Empire. Shortly afterward, he began ordering the construction of church buildings. He did so to promote the popularity and acceptance of Christianity. If the Christians had their own sacred buildings, as did the Jews and the pagans, okay, because those were not the same. I'm hearing leaders who should know better say that the temple was the church, and this is not true. The temple was not the church. The Jews had their temples, the pagans had their temples, and then Constantine chose to build churches. All right? So, Constantine had it in his mind that if we gave the Christians a physical structure like everyone else, their faith would then be regarded as legitimate. So he was trying to legitimize Christianity in the eyes of the other religions of the day, failing to realize that Christianity was already legitimized by God himself. It is important to understand Constantine's mindset, for it explains why he was so enthusiastic about the establishment of these church buildings. Constantine's thinking was dominated by superstition and pagan magic. Even after he became emperor, he allowed the old pagan institutions to remain as they were. So this wasn't Constantine tearing down other beliefs or other faiths or even other gods. He was just simply saying, we're going to carve out a place for these people called Christians as well. Following his conversion to Christianity, Constantine never abandoned sun worship. He also kept the sun on his coins, and he set up a statue of the sun god that bore his own image in the Forum of Constantinople, which was his new capital. Constantine also built a statue of the mother goddess Cybele, though he presented her in a posture of Christian prayer. So he was doing what people would call syncretism. All right? He was mixing in a little bit of what he had learned about Christ with his own pagan beliefs. Historians continue to debate whether or not Constantine was a genuine Christian. The fact that he is reported to have had his eldest son, his nephew, and his brother-in-law executed does not strengthen the case for his actual conversion, but we will not probe that too deeply. In AD 321, Constantine decreed, and again, people argue about this all day long, but this is historical fact, okay? In AD 321, Constantine decreed that Sunday would be a day of rest, a legal holiday. All right? So Sunday as a day of rest, as a legal holiday, was a Constantinian decree, not a biblical one. It appears that Constantine's intention in doing this was to honor the god Mithras, the unconquered sun. He described Sunday as the day of the sun. Now, does that mean you are not observing the Sabbath? Does that mean that you're going to hell if you worship on a Sunday as opposed to a Saturday? I don't believe that. You know why? Because Jesus said he is Lord over the Sabbath, which means you're actually supposed to be having your Sabbath in him, which also means you're actually supposed to be practicing the Sabbath every day by finding your rest in Christ. But again, that's a whole other subject. Almost to his dying day, Constantine still functioned as the high priest of paganism. In fact, he retained the pagan title Pontifex Maximus, which means chief of the pagan priests. In the 15th century, this same title became an honorific title for the Roman Catholic Pope. Oops. When Constantine dedicated Constantinople as his new capital on May 11, 330, he adorned it with treasures that were taken from heathen temples, and he used pagan magic formulas to protect crops and heal diseases. Further, all historical evidence indicates that Constantine was an egomaniac. When he built the Church of the Apostles in Constantinople, he included monuments to the 12 apostles. The 12 monuments surrounded a single tomb which lay at the center, and that tomb was reserved for Constantine himself, thus making himself the 13th and chief apostle. Thus, Constantine not only continued the pagan practice of honoring the dead, he also sought to be included as one of the significant dead. Constantine also borrowed from the pagans, not the Jews, the notion of the sacredness of objects and places. Largely due to his influence, relic mongering became common in the church. By the 4th century, obsession with relics got so bad that some Christian leaders began to speak out against it, calling it a heathen observance introduced into the churches under the cloak of religion, the work of idolaters. What is a relic? A relic can be the body of a saint. It can be the head of a saint, as we talked about last time with John the Baptist, and how John the Baptist's head is still on a platter in somebody's church. in France. All right? They're still walking around with the head of John the Baptist. That's a relic. Constantine is also noted for bringing to the Christian faith the idea of the holy site, which was based on the model of a pagan shrine. Because of the aura of sacredness that the 4th century Christians attached to Palestine, it had become known as the Holy Land by the 6th century. After Constantine's death, he was declared to be quote unquote divine. This was the custom for all pagan emperors who died before him. It was the Senate who declared him to be a pagan god at his death, and no one stopped them from doing so. At this point, a word should be said about Constantine's mother, Helena. This woman was most noted for her obsession with relics. In AD 326, Helena made a pilgrimage to Palestine. In AD 327, in Jerusalem, she reportedly found the cross and nails that were used to crucify Christ. It is reported that Constantine promoted the idea that the bits of wood that came from Christ's cross possessed spiritual powers. Truly, a pagan magical mind was at work in Emperor Constantine, the father of the church building. So, next week we will talk about his building program and how it continued to grow and expand. On to our select reading for today around women, Vindicating the Vixen, revisiting sexualized, vilified, and marginalized women of the Bible. So we are talking about Tamar, known as the righteous prostitute. And we're going to look today at Tamar and the sons of Judah and Tamar's moral dilemma. And if we have some time, we will go over the concept of a righteous prostitute. If not, we will add that to our Friday's reading. Tamar and the sons of Judah. By an arranged marriage and not by choice, Tamar landed in the wake of Judah's horribly dysfunctional family history, which we covered on yesterday. The pain of his father's rejection had turned Judah into a hardened man. Engulfed by a deeply painful father wound, Judah had proven he was capable of murder, a proclivity that ultimately threatened Tamar. Having instigated the sale of his own 17-year-old brother, Joseph, into the living death of slavery, Judah had become a human trafficker already through the sale of his brother. How else are we to describe his actions? In the grand family tradition, following his father Jacob's deceit of Isaac to obtain Esau's blessing, and Laban's deceit resulting in Jacob's marriage to Leah, Judah was also a deceiver. He heartlessly pulled off a cover-up that brought grief down on his father by allowing his father to believe that his favorite son, Joseph, was dead. It is not an impressive resume. Judah was hardly the kind of father-in-law any decent parent would wish for their daughter, especially given the powers patriarchy granted the father-in-law. As it turns out, Judah's own sons weren't any better. In the aftermath of these events, Judah leaves his family and migrates into the Canaanite territory, where he forges friendships with Canaanites, marries a forbidden Canaanite, and ultimately begins acting like a Canaanite. A terrible silence underscores the reality of Judah's father wound, for there is no mention of Jacob inconsolably grieving Judah's departure, or sending a search party to find Judah and bring him home. Instead, still shattered over losing Joseph, Jacob is now lavishing his devotion and attention on his 12th son, Benjamin. Judah's wife gives birth to 3 sons, as we read, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Tamar enters the story as the wife that Judah got for his eldest son, Er, a euphemism for an arranged marriage. Contrary to the biblical depiction of the marriage relationship, where a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh, in patriarchal cultures, the wife is absorbed into her husband's family. She becomes their property and comes under the thumb of her husband's family. People I've met from patriarchal cultures describe dynamics in mother in law, daughter in law relationships as extremely difficult. They express astonishment that Ruth the Moabitess did not jump at the chance to leave her mother in law, Naomi. In Tamar's case, we know nothing of how things went with her mother in law. Judah was the in law who wielded absolute control over her. Within patriarchy, a girl becomes marriageable when she reaches puberty. So Tamar was likely married off in her early teens. Before she ever conceived a child, God took the life of her husband Er because he was, quote, wicked in the Lord's sight. We are spared the sordid details, but it is not a stretch to imagine that Tamar experienced the brunt of marriage, possibly to a wicked man, and maybe towards her. At this point, the story moves into a strange ancient cultural custom. According to patriarchal customs widely practiced at the time, not just amongst Israelites, all right, but it was later formalized under Mosaic law, the surviving brother of the deceased man's widow were honor bound to marry and produce a missing male heir who will assume the vacant spot on the family tree. Whenever I've taught the story of Tamar, women tell me that this part of the story is creepy. In compliance with this practice, Judah passes Tamar to his second son, Onan, with a mandate to fulfill his duty to his dead brother. But Onan is a wicked man also. Although he marries Tamar, it is all a sham. Instead of impregnating her, he continually uses her for his own pleasure. And when he does so, he spills his seed on the ground to prevent her from conceiving. No doubt an early form of contraception, also known today medically as coitus interruptus. Those of you who are scientists who are listening today, or those of you who are in the sexual education field, you know, coitus interruptus just basically means the man pulled out. All right. So this was an early form of contraception. But in this case, a violation of his family duty. He was faking honor by marrying her and then repeatedly abused her in this manner. He knew full well the son Tamar conceived would not be his, but it would be his brother Er's. We may be without details of what marriage to wicked Er was like, although marriage to any wicked man is no picnic. In contrast, Onan's treatment of Tamar was overtly abusive, and the narrator gives us God's perspective on the matter. Again, we are told of another of Judah's sons that, quote, what Onan did was wicked in the Lord's sight. So the Lord put him to death also, leaving Judah with one remaining son who at the time was too young to marry. Now, people may think that this is really harsh, but I need people to understand that when you are married and you are doing things to dishonor your spouse, God does not look on that lightly. This story is like, I would say, on the extreme end. But if you are in a marriage, if you are in a covenant, and you are doing things that abuse your spouse or that dishonors your spouse, please do not think that God is just looking at you and winking. The scriptures is very clear how God felt about it. So thank God for the dispensation of grace, but that still does not take away the heart of God concerning how you treat your spouse in a marital relationship. So, what is Tamar's moral dilemma here? A word of explanation is in order. Not to justify Onan's actions, but to illuminate his motive and also to provide a framework for Tamar's subsequent actions. A man's responsibility to father a son for a blood brother who died without a son came at an exorbitant cost. Under the simple modern inheritance laws, anyone knows the death of an heir means the surviving heirs will inherit more. Under primogeniture, the gains were even higher if the deceased brother was the firstborn. So Onan was acutely aware of the heavy price that he would pay if Tamar conceived a son for his brother heir, meaning he wanted personally most of the inheritance that would come. And the only way he could do that would be to not produce an heir that would take the dead brother's missing place in the inheritance line. So the math is actually pretty simple. Under patriarchy, a man divided his estate amongst his sons, although not equally. Primogeniture designated a double share to the first son. So, for example, as the father of three sons, Judah would divide his inheritance into four equal parts, and 2/4 of that, or the double portion, went to his firstborn. Judah's two younger sons would only pocket 1/4 of the inheritance. So the death of Er was a financial windfall for Judah's two surviving sons. Now Judah's estate gets sliced into three parts instead of four, with 2/3 going to Onan and 1/3 to Shelah, a sizable increase for both of them. Onan's inheritance more than doubles, jumping from 1/4 to 2/3. If family honor takes precedence, though, and Tamar conceives a son, his inheritance plummets from the 2 full thirds of Judah's estate back to the 1/4, or a loss of about 50% of the estate. So obviously, family honor created a tremendous conflict of interest for Onan. Would he fulfill his duty to his brother by marrying Tamar, fathering a child with her, and forfeiting Er's inheritance, which would go to their offspring, or would he keep the winnings for himself? No one has to wonder what a financial advisor would tell him. This family duty was an enormous call to sacrifice for the good of a brother who was not around. And boy, is there a sermon in that. So, he was basically having his cake and eating it too. He was keeping a part of the inheritance for himself while at the same time pleasuring himself through the brother's wife and refusing to do right by the family. So this was dishonorable on a couple of levels. And not only was it dishonorable, he was also financially stealing from the next generation. Turns out, Onan was willing to violate family honor to preserve his holdings. The price he paid for his wicked actions cost him a whole lot more than a slice of Judah's financial estate. After Onan's death, Judah superstitiously concluded that Tamar was the reason his sons were dying. So Judah sent her back to her father to wait until Shelah reached marriageable age, having no intentions of following through with a marriage between Tamar and Shelah. Judah referred, Judah preferred enduring dead branches on his family tree rather than risking the life of his only surviving son. Because remember, superstitious wise, he thought Tamar was the one that was causing his sons to die. A long time passed, long enough for Tamar to realize that Judah had no intentions of following through on his promise of a marriage to Shelah. This realization marked the tipping point for Tamar. His deception created the moral dilemma. His deception created the moral dilemma. His deception, his son's deception, and both of his sons' wickedness created the moral dilemma. Would she resign herself to Judah's roadblock, to the fulfillment of her duty to her deceased husband, I'm going to read that question again. Would she resign herself to Judah's roadblock to the fulfillment of her duty to her dead husband, or would she resort to other means to rescue the dying line of her husband? Remarkably, the stakes from Tamar's point of view had nothing in common with how Onan or Judah saw things. Both men were driven by self-interest at the expense of others. Suddenly, there was a member of the family who was moved by a different motive. She would not be party to forsaking family duty in the name of self-preservation. She would sacrifice herself for the sake of another if that's what it took. Even for a dead man who would never know what she was willing to risk to perpetuate his branch of the family tree and bring it back to life. Whoo boy, a righteous prostitute. Often called the world's oldest profession, prostitution today has been more accurately recast as sex trafficking. We now know criminal elements are at work enslaving women and girls, men and boys too, victimizing tens of millions of God's image bearers globally and profiteering on selling their bodies again and again. No longer are prostitutes regarded as the problem. It has become evident that the vast majority of them are actually victims of crime. Laws are now changing to reflect this understanding so that law enforcement's practice of arresting prostitutes is stopping, and instead they're going after the pimps and the traffickers themselves. I know recently a law was passed, I can't remember where, but initially when they would arrest children who had been involved in prostitution, they were actually charging the children with prostitution rather than recognizing that they were actually victims of sex trafficking. So charging them with prostitution was not helpful. And then not dealing with them as the victims of sex trafficking, meaning they didn't get any of the help, any of the counseling, any of the services required after they have been pulled out of a life of being human trafficked, specifically for sex. So there are laws now that are changing around that, thankfully. Sex trafficking is a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions in our 21st century world. In their prize-winning New York Times bestseller, Half the Sky, authors Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodan identified sex trafficking as one of the paramount human rights problems of this century. Sex trafficking is not simply a problem elsewhere, but as President Jimmy Carter stated in a call to action, it is known that teenage girls are sold by pimps and placed in brothels in all large American cities, almost invariably with the local police being complicit or waiting for more important things to command their attention. Prostitution is a violent and hideous thriving underworld fueled primarily by Johns, or men who seek to feed their sexual appetites both virtually through pornography and in person at strip clubs, massage parlors, brothels, and hotels, and who are willing to pay. Sex trafficking is entirely demand driven, and the demand for sexual services is insatiable. Now, there was recently a case involving a singer, correct? By the name of Cardi B. And Cardi B recently came out and admitted that she was drugging men and taking their money, which is horrible and needs to be dealt with. However, there were men out here comparing Cardi B to Bill Cosby. And I just want to read a response to that. All right? Comparing Cardi B to Bill Cosby, let's be clear. These men were soliciting her as a prostitute, also known as a sex worker. For those who buy sex, You don't know if you're soliciting a sex slave, an underage teen, or an abused woman who is being forced to go out and make money either for her pimp or her husband. This actually goes on. Most prostitutes are victims themselves, and these men who seek them are taking advantage of their misfortune and their unfortunate situation. This is in no way this is an apples and orange situation if you're trying to compare her to Bill Cosby, who was actually drugging and raping women. Even the most recent sting with the Patriots owner and those busted, they were found to be having sexual activity with sex slaves, and they didn't even know it because they didn't care to ask. They wanted sex at any cost. Those men have not come forward who McCarty allegedly drugged, possibly because they were married. She reported that they willingly took the drugs. So, if you're stepping out in risky sexual behavior and you're paying for sex, no, you do not deserve to be drugged, but you are opening the door to be taken advantage of because you are operating in the same vein of taking advantage of women, some of them sex slaves that you may not be aware of. All right? And then I wrote here, read Hosea 4 and see who God addresses for turning a nation of women into prostitutes. Matter of fact, let's go to Hosea 4 so you can know for yourself who God is holding responsible for this kind of behavior. I don't want you to just believe me. I want you to hear it from God. Hosea 4. Let me start at Hosea 4, starting at verse 9. And there shall be like people, like priests, like people, like priests. And I will punish them for their ways and reward them for their doings. For they shall eat and not have enough. They will commit whoredom and shall not increase. Because they have left off taking heed to the Lord. You stop listening to God. Whoredom and wine and new wine takes away the heart from God. Verse 12. My people ask counsel at their stocks, and their staff declareth unto them. For the spirit of whoredoms has caused them to err, and they have gone a whoring from under their God. Verse 13. They sacrifice upon the tops of the mountains, and burn incense upon the hills, under oaks and poplars and elms, because the shadow thereof is good. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom, and your spouses shall commit adultery. Verse 14. These are God's words, not ours. I will not punish your daughters when they commit whoredom, nor your spouses when they commit adultery, for themselves are separated with whores, and they sacrifice with harlots. Therefore the people that does not understand shall fall. Though thou, Israel, play the harlot, yet let not Judah offend, and come not ye unto Gilgal, nor go ye up to Bethaven, nor swear, the Lord liveth. For Israel backslideth as a backsliding heifer. Now the Lord will feed them as a lamb in a large place. What is he saying? Why are the daughters going in error? It didn't start with the daughters. It started with the priests. It started with those who were supposed to be taking counsel of God that has now brought a spirit of whoredoms into the land. And so until we deal with that, God says, I'm not going to punish them because a spirit of whoredoms has been brought into the land. So let's take a look at what our writer here says. When encountered in scripture, stories such as Tamar's, Rahab's, and that of the sinful woman who wept and poured perfume on Jesus' feet give the church opportunities to raise the subject of prostitution and other forms of sexual abuse and to confront an issue to which the church cannot in good conscience turn a blind eye. We need to confront the issue, first of all, because this crisis seeps into the church. Tragically, high numbers of Christian men and boys, and some women too, are complicit. Those who sit in church pews, study in seminaries, serve on elder boards, and stand behind pulpits, who nevertheless are addicted to pornography, which depends largely on exploiting trafficked women and girls. But a second reason human trafficking is an important issue is simple. We are God's image bearers, and we have responsibility to engage in evil that destroys the lives of everyone who comes into contact with it. It even affects those of us who have the power to do something to address these atrocities, yet choose to do nothing. We are mistaken to convince ourselves that this crisis has nothing to do with us. Human trafficking is happening within our own communities, both the buying and the selling of human flesh. This is not an issue that the church can afford to avoid. The Bible brings it up. So, what causes a girl or a woman to become a prostitute? A major cause is simply the reality of being born female in a world that privileges males and disadvantages females from birth. The devaluing of girls combined with poverty is a deadly cocktail for many hapless young girls. Parents and other relatives are known to offload their daughters, even little girls, selling them to traffickers, sometimes in hopes of deriving income from their trafficked family members' employment. This is patriarchy at its worst. A thriving sex trafficking industry means the vast majority of women and girls are not voluntarily involved, but they are forced into prostitution, sold by relatives, or ensnared by pimps. Pimps prey on vulnerable, at risk, unhappy, and runaway girls. And it has since gotten worse because now there is so much digital interaction happening that they're able to collect young girls that they target online through looking at their social media pages, seeing what they're writing about, seeing whether or not their parents are paying any attention, and then they rope the girls in with meeting them in person, and they wind up getting pulled into human trafficking. All right? So, these girls are sometimes prime targets for pimps who spot them at malls, at Starbucks, hanging out after school, and in our neighborhoods. A pimp woos, indulges, and grooms a girl into a corner from which there is no escape. Then suddenly, no more Mr. Nice Guy. He uses violence, he uses threats against family members, he uses drugs to intimidate, control, and bolt and lock the door to no way out. In some cultures, a sexually violated girl brings shame on her family, so even if she somehow escapes, she has no place to go or return to. So, is there such a thing? Is there such a person as a righteous prostitute? The writer of Hebrews seems to think so, exalting Rahab the harlot as an exemplar of faith. Believe it or not, there are also altruistic motives for becoming involved in this prostitution. That Jewish girl in Nazi Germany is a perfect example of women who have self sacrificed for the good or the protection of others. Sometimes a destitute woman sees no other alternative than prostitution in order to keep her children alive or to keep her children from being trafficked. It will no doubt come as a surprise to many readers that Tamar fits this category as well. For family honor in Judah's family is being cast aside by every member, a travesty that forces her to devise a scheme to pose as a prostitute to rescue the line of her undeserving husband, heir. Prostitution is just one form of abuse that illuminates the enormous power differential between males and females. That differential is greatest where patriarchal values are enforced. Under patriarchy, any power a woman enjoys resides in the male relative who is willing to speak for her and take action for wrongs she has suffered. Even then, the motive is often because the alleged crime violates male honor in the family and has little to do with whether or not her own rights as a woman and as a human being were violated. She has no power of her own, no voice or agency or rights. So, we will stop there for today. If you would like to add to our conversation or you have a comment that you want to make on any of today's readings, you can go ahead and punch the double smiley face and we will bring you in. I want to thank those of you while we're waiting. I want to thank those of you who have tuned in today for our broadcast. Today's giveaway is a mug in celebration of Women's History Month. You will get a mug like so. All you have to do, what is today's challenge? Today's challenge is write and tell me about a woman who personally influenced your life. Tell me about a woman who personally influenced your life in order to be put in for our drawing for today's gift. We do have a winner for Monday and Tuesday's gift. Wednesday's gift was a book on female CEOs. If you want to participate in that drawing, it is still going on. Tell me about a female entrepreneur. If you want to participate in today's drawing, which is the mug, tell me about a woman who has personally influenced your life. You can send your answer to reachshantae@gmail.com. Again, that's reachshantae, SHANTAE, @gmail.com. I want to thank you today for your time and attention. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out today and be light. Remember, things aren't always as they seem. Take another look. Go ahead and read through Hosea 4. Go ahead and read through Genesis 38 and take a closer look at the story of Tamar and Judah. Take care and God bless.